First, I want to, in advance, congratulate the InciteHealth Fellows, and I think what's going to be a wonderful evening. You'll have to show us that that's the case, but really looking forward to the evening. I also want to thank the InciteHealth team. I think Paula's going to be introducing a number of them later, so you'll get to meet some of the people who helped to launch and run InciteHealth. And what we've been trying to do in InciteHealth is really invent the future of healthcare, viewed from the perspective of the primary care team and the patient. As Paula will tell you about, what the teams have done is, as they've identified problems, they've been working closely with patients to make sure they're developing solutions that really address the needs of patients. We're really privileged tonight to have a speaker here who is a nationally known innovator, Sachin Jain. He had played a role in the creation of the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, which many of us knows really is leading innovation in payment and healthcare nationally. He was a Chief Innovation Officer at Merck, and is now the Chief Medical Officer at CareMore, which is really a very innovative company that's sort of redesigning how we care for older patients and those with complex needs. Please join me in welcoming Sachin and thanking him for being here this evening.
The first thing I thought hearing Russ introduce me is, man, I can't hold down a job. And I'm hoping, I'll be able to kind of have a decent tenure at CareMore, where I've had a really, I think, exciting start over the last year. This actually marks my 1-year departure from Boston, city where I lived for most of the previous 16 years. And so it's really wonderful to be here, and I just want to thank Russ and Paula and the center for having me. It's always fun to come back, and it's always great to see a lot of familiar faces. I'm gonna give you what I think is a little bit of a sobering talk, and I'll end hopefully on a high note. I've been around this healthcare innovation space for a while. My father was a physician. Grew up with medicine. Really in my family, in my culture, in my blood. Pavan Bhattacharya's here. We went to college together. He can tell you, it was around. It was in the ether, and I think we've got some real problems in the healthcare innovation space, and I think that there are problems that really can only be solved if we actually talk openly and honestly about them. This is being recorded. I may be out of a job tomorrow, so if anybody wants to offer me one tomorrow, give me a call. So I think we're really in the middle of a very special moment in history. And I think the challenge before all of us is how we actually make the most of it. I think the best thing I could say about it is it's really the best of times for those of us who actually want to change primary care. I think for the first time, there's actually a recognition that there's a problem. If we were having this conversation 15 or 20 years ago, I think people would say things are mostly okay. I think they would have said quality was good. They would say that there weren't any real healthcare disparities, and we all know that not to be the case. And so I think there's a common national understanding of what some of the problems are in primary care, which I think creates the opportunity for us to actually have a real conversation about how to actually fix them. I think for the first time, we actually have the health information technology infrastructure to begin transforming primary care. Whatever you think about the current state of EHR systems or the HITECH Act's meaningful use provisions, we actually now have a federal health IT infrastructure where there wasn't one before. And on the payment side, the Affordable Care Act created the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation with real power to transform how we actually pay for primary care. And so I think the combination of health IT and payment reform actually reflects, it's actually rocket fuel for the healthcare change makers among us. And I think finally, for the first time, and this room is a clear reflection of that, we have better talent that's turning its gaze towards changing our primary care system. When I started as a student at Harvard Medical School, I remember feeling incredibly unique, but also very marginalized, because my interest was not only in learning medicine, but also in driving change in policy and practice. I'll always remember one of my HMS tutorial leaders say, he's going to do policy. He's not really sure about medicine. And the reality is that I think I was mistranslated because I think both go hand in hand. And I think that there's an increasing recognition of that today, and there's an increasing recognition throughout the walls of every medical school or quad in the country, where you now will bump into people every day who've got great ideas about how to transform healthcare delivery and primary care especially. Everywhere I go, I see a new healthcare hackathon, I see a new healthcare accelerator, and they're just teaming with people who are launching new ventures. And tonight's event, I think, and the incredible participants here are evidence that really there is more human capital and better human capital being deployed to change primary care than ever before. And so these are the things that give me a lot of optimism. And yet I worry. I actually worry a lot. I worry that when I walk through most hospitals, clinics, and health systems around the country, the loud noise that's actually being made by words like innovation, transformation, and strategy is obscuring the powerful murmurs of intransigence and stubbornness that still dominates our primary care system in this country. I worry that underneath the smoke of healthcare innovation, there is no real fire. I worry that pilot, a word that we all hear so much in this field, is code for sorry. I can't say yes, but I'm too polite to say no. I worry that rather than this being the single most important moment in the evolution of our country's healthcare system, it will be remembered as a missed opportunity. I worry that we're living in an innovation bubble. Now, there's a disconnect between the conferences I attend, the journals and blogs that I read, and the reality of primary care medical practice on the front lines of healthcare delivery. There's a change layer, the cloud in which visionary ideas about transforming primary care resides, but there's also a reality layer, the place where most primary care is actually delivered. And both are necessary. Both are absolutely necessary. But the funny reality is that there's actually very little mixing between them. So while there's a booming primary care innovation industry, a new startup being created every day, a new app being launched every minute, the actual experience of delivering or receiving primary care is changing scarcely. In fact, many elements of the change layer, startup companies, innovation centers, are structured to isolate and incubate change. The most charitable view is that new models of patient care must be supported separate from the rest of an unmoving enterprise, that innovative solutions and models are too disruptive and must be protected, that over time these new innovations will arise from the change layer and trickle in to the reality layer. But I think there's another more cynical view that many elements of the change layer have been created and supported by the incumbents to deliberately kick the can down the road, that those who occupy the change layer are content to float above the hard work of changing crusty old clinical operations in favor of innovation conferences and startup ventures, that much of what is continuously described as new is really window dressing on the same old stuff. And my challenge to you tonight is to prove this perspective wrong. When I was a medical student, I excitedly read a Boston Globe cover article about a local Massachusetts health plan that piloted a program to pay primary care physicians to respond to their patient email inquiries. And at the time, it felt like it was truly visionary. It was a health plan that was actually keeping up with the times and trying to use technology to incent care delivery in new ways. 10 years later, I sat on a panel with someone from that very health plan where they continued to talk about this pilot as if it was new, as if there was something still to learn before scaling it more broadly. It was truly jarring. When I was a research fellow at HBS, I studied a progressive health system that I'd admired from afar for a really long time. I see Penny Carver in the audience. I first learned about this health system when I was a summer intern at IHI. And the health system had become externally famous for integrating open access scheduling to enable same-day appointments into its primary care practices. And when I began to visit the practices within the system, it became clear that the so-called innovation was limited to a few practices among the more than 50 within the system. Most patients waited months for appointments just like they do everywhere else. And when I worked in the pharmaceutical industry, I watched with curiosity as the industry launched countless initiatives to move beyond the pill, to build services and solutions businesses to enhance primary care outcomes, only to undercapitalize them and quietly shut them down without notice. The industry was unable to sustainably think about a future outside of high-margin molecules, just as many doctors' offices and health systems are unable to think of a future without fee-for-service. So what are the obligations of those of us who exist within the change layer? How can we make the change layer more impactful in reality? How can we not waste this special moment in history where so many stars truly seem to be aligning? One of my mentors in medical school was someone that many of you know or know of, and that was Jim Kim, who was previously of Partners in Health and now president of the World Bank. And Jim spent much of the past decade arguing that we need a greater focus on a so-called science of delivery. That is, studying how interventions are scaled in order to enable and facilitate greater diffusion of innovation to close the gap between best clinical science and best practice. And I believe Jim was right. I even worked with a colleague to launch a journal to support the development of this field. Yet I think that a science of delivery is not a replacement for good leadership. And that is the challenge to everyone here today. We need leaders who define their jobs as closing the gap between the change layer and the reality layer, leaders who aim to converge aspirational visions with the front lines of clinical care. The science of delivery, rather than being a science of how do we scale, is really common sense organizational behavior, integrity, and leadership. The fundamental task of the person leading innovation in an organization is not to invent the new idea or develop the new solution. It's actually to create the environmental conditions such that any new idea will actually have a fighting chance to survive or thrive. More than anything, we need to adopt and demand everywhere we go a new pace. Somewhere along the lines, it became acceptable in healthcare to have change management timelines that stretch from days to weeks to months to years for things that we already know work. And those of us who start out impatient to change the world accept these longer timelines over time. Somewhere along the way, on the front lines of healthcare delivery, we convinced ourselves that change is necessarily slow. Shame on us. Having worked in the federal government, academic medicine, and also large corporations, many people are often surprised when I say that the pace of change was fastest in the federal government when we were implementing new legislation. The reason for this pace was that there was a clear sense of urgency and a culture of speed and accountability that was created by our leaders. There were deadlines, an intolerance for bureaucratic malaise. There was fear of being called to Congress to testify. So I would argue that any of us who desires to change care must not just challenge the system with new ideas. Ideas are cheap, ideas are easy, but also new expectations of pace and scale that engage both the change layer and the reality layer. In my current role as Chief Medical Officer of an innovative primary care delivery system and health plan, I often jokingly say that pilot is a four-letter word. We need fewer pilots and more will, momentum, and frankly, courage to implement change. Don't accept anything less. Now, this view is not without its skeptics. The nation is populated with healthcare leaders, I know a bunch of them, who've lost their jobs and their shirts by pushing a change agenda too far, too fast. But when I put on my clinical hat, there's actually an ethical dimension to our pace, namely that if we take too long to implement changes to healthcare delivery that we know will benefit our patients, we're withholding necessary improvements in care. I think we need to push forward with our best new ideas to transform primary care at scale because it's the right and ethical thing to do for our patients. And I think that the real secret in closing the gap between the change and reality layers is in creating a clinical culture where innovation is not viewed as the domain of the few, but actually the responsibility of the many. The first sign of the beginning of the end for aspirational organizations is when any new idea is instinctively met with the word no. And I would say the second is the creation of the position of Chief Innovation Officer, and I say that partly in jest as someone who until recently held that title. Most large healthcare organizations have optimized themselves for the business of healthcare delivery, but in so doing so, have sub-optimized themselves for real innovation. Organizations are successful at achieving real innovation by making it the job of frontline staff to implement creative ideas every day, not as a part of a special project or special initiatives. And without this cultural imperative, I think most innovation will be a tasty side dish, not the main course. And I think that this mindset shift really requires a culture that enables, allows for, and even rewards a healthy disdain for the status quo. But many organizations and their leaders instinctively hold on to the status quo because it's what made them successful previously. And in this case, I think no amount of energy or agitation from the change layer will ever find its way into the reality layer. No number of hackathons, patient-centered tools, or decision aids will ever be infused because the individuals with the keys to the kingdom won't let you in to change it. And that's actually why I'm so excited about what's happening here today. Because I think that events like this one actually represent a bringing together of the change layer and the reality layer. The bringing together of what would previously or historically be described as a conservative institution like Harvard Medical School and its teaching hospitals with the most innovative and thoughtful primary care minds of our generation, really reflects the bringing together of those change layers and reality layers. And so I frankly can't wait to hear your pitches. I think we have all the ingredients to make the most of this moment in healthcare. We have the right problem definition, we have the right technologies and payment models, we have the right talent entering the field. And I think my hope is that events like this one will enable the type of authentic dialogue about how we might be able to narrow the gap between what we think should be happening and what is happening, and bring together the change and reality layers together forever. Thank you very much.